I've got my emotional support drinking vessel. It's not Life Day, but this is in honor of Star Wars Celebration happening in London, but truth be told, I'm much more of a Trekkie. Hi, welcome back. This first installment is about Oscar-nominated knitwear and specifically this year's Oscar ceremony. I know it was about a month ago. I've been busy. It's been extremely rainy and gray here in Seattle, so not the best filming conditions since I'm relying on natural light. So I haven't seen all the Oscar-nominated titles from this past year, but the ones that I saw, there was enough to, I think this is potentially going to be a long video, especially on one particular topic. There's like a clue in frame of what we're going to talk about. But yeah, I'll save that for last and kind of cover the quicker ones first. I want to say thank you also for the very warm reception. Like I said in the last video, the industry and the community around knitting has completely changed in the time that I've been gone, and I'm so excited to feel like a newcomer again. Like I'm rediscovering, just, you know, stumbling upon patterns and designers that I'm not familiar with, and you know, I do feel like I'm like sort of frozen in amber, like the mosquito in Jurassic Park. Like I still have things to share that are hopefully of value, but I'm also feeling like a newborn lamb to kind of mix my metaphors, I guess, and keep it springtimey. But yeah, I'm really feeling that like return of the newcomer passion for the hobby that I thought I had lost. So already this video making endeavor is like accomplishing the mission. Before I get too far into the Oscar knits, I do want to talk about some knitting that I saw on screen at the movies. It was opening weekend of Dungeons and Dragons, the movie, and Honor Amongst Thieves, I think it's called. I've only played Dungeons and Dragons one time. This is pure coincidence. I'm not wearing a Hellfire Club shirt, but I sort of have a little Eddie Munson vibe today. But I am very interested in Dungeons and Dragons just as a cultural phenomenon. Anytime there's a panel available, if I'm at a con, I will go. The best one I ever went to was like the connection between Satanic Panic in the 80s and Dungeons and Dragons. It was fascinating. But yeah, I've only been able to play once. But I did go to see the movie just because I had heard some positive feedback, and I was intrigued, and it just looked like a really fun fantasy adventure. So was not disappointed at all. I loved it. It was a packed theater. That's a rarity these days. I go to the movies quite a lot, and it often is a pretty sparse crowd. There's just something really special about seeing a comedy with a lot of other people around. You're much more likely to laugh in a group setting. So that's been proven. That's like a psychological fact. So the costumes in the movie are by Amanda Monk. She has been attached to a lot of Ricky Gervais projects. I have notes on my phone here. She also worked on something called Dwarves Assemble. If you are avoiding all spoilers, then skip to this timestamp. Within the first 10 minutes of the movie, it opens in a prison. You've got Chris Pine's Bard character and Michelle Rodriguez. I think she was playing a barbarian. And they're just sitting there. She's eating potatoes and he is knitting. So really funny to see that. Like anytime you see knitting on camera, it's usually people like hitting two sticks together, and like the yarn is not even attached in any way, and they're just creating like a tangle. It's really embarrassing how little it looks like the actual process of knitting. This, you know, I actually was so shocked and also trying to take in like all the other elements on screen that I didn't focus on his technique. He was calm and restrained in a way that it wasn't distracting. But the thing that I loved the most was that he talked about construction methods. Like he said, I think he was using straight needles, which a lot of people online are like, oh, you can't knit mittens on straights. You definitely can. It's not ideal. It's not what I would have liked to have seen. Would have been great to see him juggling some double pointed needles that he like whittled out of, you know, I don't know, some material that he found in his cell. But no, he did talk about converting the pattern from, well, not pattern. He was just like, I think I'll do it without fingers and I'll do mittens instead of gloves. I've heard that's easier. So I'm like, where did you hear that? Prehistoric Ravelry? So yeah, it was delightful. The yarn was, I can't remember who made a colorway like this. I want to say it was Blue Moon Fiber Arts, but there was a sock yarn color called Peas and Carrots. I actually think I have a skein of it in my stash. I think it was a freebie. Honestly, I would never have chosen that combo of orange and green together. But yeah, it was really funny. It looked like homespun. And when he eventually gave the gift that he was making for this person, he gave them the mittens, and you could tell that there were like, the ends weren't woven in. It was sort of knotted roughly. And it reminded me of Vicky Howell when she interviewed, this is years ago, again, back in the early to mid aughts. There was a magazine called Knit1, N1, I think it was stylized. It was a subset of Vogue Knitting, and they had an issue that was like the men's issue, and it wasn't necessarily men who knit, although I think there were a few featured. At the time it was less common, and I think it was like knits for men. And yeah, there was an interview Vicky did. She interviewed Will Forte and taught him how to knit. And I think they knew each other in Austin, and he reported back after like being away. She taught him, and then they did the interview a few weeks later or something. And she's like, "How did your scarf go?" And he said, "Well, I got to the end and I couldn't remember how you taught me to finish it. And so I just like knitted the crap out of it and made a bunch of knots, and it was done." So that's kind of what Chris Pine's project looked like in the film. Like, that's what he did. And you know, that's what I tell knitters when they're just starting. If I'm teaching someone how to knit, I tell them, like, if it holds together and keeps you warm, then it's fine. Like, you can learn finishing. Learning good finishing is a lifelong process, and we'll talk a little more about that later. That's a little foreshadowing. More foreshadowing. I'm all about it. So I couldn't find a source for why knitting ended up in this Dungeons and Dragons movie. I sort of suspected that maybe it's like in Harry Potter when, you know, they kind of cottoned on to the fact, that was an unintentional fiber pun, by the way. They sort of figured out that knitters also loved this Harry Potter world, and so they kind of included more knitting as the films went on. At least that's what it felt like. They were kind of pandering to the fans. I don't know if that's true for Dungeons and Dragons. If anyone knows, let me know. I tried to find if there was like some connection with the costumer or the production designer, who, by the way, Amanda Monk did the costumes, and I believe she probably got this role because of her work in a movie called Dwarves Assemble. It looks like a comedy fantasy, kind of appropriate for this. She's also worked on a lot of Ricky Gervais Netflix shows, and she's working on an upcoming Netflix fantasy film called Damsel, which stars Millie Bobby Brown. Ray Chan did the production design. He's known for Avengers Endgame, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Children of Men. Yeah, speaking of post-apocalyptic, when I was researching this, I stumbled across a photo of Nicholas Hoult on the set of Mad Max Fury Road. Apparently Charlize Theron, who's from South Africa, where there is like a somewhat thriving knitting community, they make a lot of mohair there, she knew how to knit and taught the war boys how to knit. So there's this great photo of Nukes on set knitting with all of his makeup on. I've been a Nicholas Hoult fan since he started. Like, About a Boy is one of my favorite movies of all time, and he wears some really cool knitwear in that, little hats and things like that. It's very cute. But yeah, he's all grown up now. He's gonna be in Renfield. I'm seeing that hopefully opening night. Yeah, I'm like a huge Nick Hoult fan. So where were we? Not sure if he's still knitting, but if he is, then I'm just like even more of a fan than I already was.
Knitting Mad
Max?
Knitting Mad Max.
That was a hobby I had on the set of Mad Max.
Oh. I'm like, is he knitting Mad Max?
I didn't knit Mad Max. That would have been incredible.
I was like, that's incredible.
If you watch the movie and you realise that it was just all something that I knitted.
That would be fantastic.
That would be cool. But no, I knitted on the set of the film to pass time.
So you knitted during Mad Max. You wrote poetry during the J.D. Salinger film.
Not poetry, just like little stories.
And then you painted during prep for Tolkien.
Uh-huh. Pick up some hobbies.
You got a lot of hobbies.
I knitted hats and scarves. I knitted this. Hats and scarves. I learned to make little bubbles too. Baubles? I quit though. I quit knitting because I got orders to make hats for people on set, and I had to make 2 in one day, and it took me 10 hours straight to make them. So I went cold turkey.
So I've got to go to set, guys.
It was one of my days off. I didn't open the curtains. I went cold turkey after that because it took the joy out of knitting.
Well, the first one I want to talk about is Elvis, and you might kind of be surprised to hear that. Elvis is not really associated with knitwear, at least in his career and on stage, like his on-stage outfits. The costume designer for this was Catherine Martin. She's been a longtime collaborator with Baz Luhrmann. They're partnered, I believe married, longtime partnership. And yeah, she's also sometimes the art director and production designer for the films as well. I really enjoyed elements of Elvis. I'm not going to be giving reviews of movies necessarily, but I'll give you like my high level thoughts. Romeo and Juliet is one of my all-time favorite films, the 1995 version with Claire Danes and Leonardo DiCaprio. I believe it's 95. I do want to take a quick moment to thank Wild Hunt Design, Alex Tinsley, for putting together my logo and some brand assets and all the things I needed to kind of start this channel with a little bit of polish. She was really great to work with, and I highly recommend her services. We're also like longtime knitwear designer compatriots, going way back, and we also kind of like tiptoed away from the world at around the same time and found other niches to kind of burrow into. But we're both still like knitters at heart. I think we always will be. And she did a fantastic collection called Apocalypse Knits. I believe that's the title. The model on the front has a gas mask. It's very cool. And yeah, big fan of that aesthetic and her just general willingness to be cheeky like that. While I was working with Alex, she asked me she had a great questionnaire that I filled out. It was super fun to ask about my aesthetic and style and what I wanted this channel and assets related to it to look like. And one of the images that I put on our shared Pinterest board was Romeo and Juliet, the movie, with Claire Danes and Leonardo DiCaprio. So yeah, I've been a Baz Luhrmann fan since early on. I feel like he's always sort of, that movie in particular has always influenced my style and just what I find beautiful. I won't say that I've like kept up with his career beat for beat, but seeing Elvis, I didn't totally love everything about it. I think that the energy of it, the sort of visual onslaught, that there was a lot kind of competing for your attention. I also saw this movie on a Screen X where it's kind of a, not 360, but like 270 wraparound screen, I believe. It's larger than IMAX. It sort of bleeds off the edges and wraps. It's really interesting, but that could have contributed to my sense of overwhelm, but it was appropriate. I mean, that is very much what I think the rise and mania that Elvis incited probably felt like in the 60s. I mean, my mom talked about being like just a rabid fan, and that hysteria, the high-pitched screams, like you really felt that from certain parts of this film. And yeah, there were just other parts that I didn't love as much. Tom Hanks, I think at this point in his career, maybe he's looking for challenges. The accent work was really like kind of over the top and comical in a lot of places. The prosthetics were distracting. So yeah, I wasn't a fan of that as a framing device, but Austin Butler was incredible. I know that Prada contributed some of Priscilla's costumes and Elvis's as well. A couple of things that did stand out and stay with me. I didn't know that Elvis played with gender in the way that he did. So apparently early on he was wearing makeup. He had pretty bad acne and acne scarring. So he was using that to cover it up. He was also using like smoky eyeliner to sort of just increase his allure on stage. I thought that was really cool in a time when gendered play was probably less accepted, especially him being in the South. Like, I just found that really, really cool and brave of him. Then his style, how he patched it together with a mixture of, I mean, he borrowed obviously from Black community, Black culture. I think as with his music, he borrowed a lot from Black culture that's sort of touched on in the film, but not necessarily like critiqued in any meaningful way. He also was inspired by his mother. So apparently one of my favorite outfits in the film was very early on. It's a pink lace shirt, I believe, unbuttoned all the way down kind of to the belly, very tight fitting. And then it's paired with these high-waisted, voluminous sort of, I want to say 40s zoot suit kind of silhouette trousers and a thin leather belt, if I'm remembering that correctly. He looked incredible, and it's also an outfit that I sort of want to wear. And apparently the lace was something that he borrowed from his mother. So they don't explicitly ever say that, but there's a scene at the very end of the film where he is mourning the passing of his mother. Maybe it's in the middle. But yeah, spoiler alert, his mother passes away, and he's seen kind of clutching her dresses and like just surrounding himself with that. It seemed like such a clear link for him to his mother to wear lace. So the part that actually made me almost fall out of my chair was there's a special that happened, and it came to be known as the 1968 Elvis Comeback Special, but it was sponsored by Singer Sewing Machines, or just sponsored by Singer, and they're most well known for making sewing machines. And I at the time at least, and still. There's this great quote. Basically, Tom Hanks says, there's this great quote. This is from a Vanity Fair article about the film. In Lerman's film, Hanks plays it hammy and over the top. It works when he issues a rejoinder to Hank Snow, who objects to Elvis's wiggling, but his funniest line is almost lost in the hustle and bustle of the filming of Elvis's '68 comeback special, sponsored by the Singer Sewing Machine Company. Walking down the hall, the Colonel hits up the Singer rep for a free machine for Priscilla. Mrs. Presley is quite a homemaker, Priscilla is, and I'm sure she would love to have one of the machines so she could knit Elvis a sweater. Angling for swag. So you're probably thinking sewing machines to knit a sweater. There was actually a knitting machine in the movie. It was in the background scene of after or in between when they're filming the comeback special. Everyone's wearing like Christmas sweaters, gaudy Christmas sweaters. They couldn't get Elvis into one, and I think maybe by the end of it they did, but what he chose to wear instead was incredible. So see it for the clothes alone is my main message to you about Elvis. But yeah, in a scene, they were in a back alley, they're on a studio lot, and there's all this Singer merchandise around, and there's a Singer knitting machine. And I actually wasn't aware that Singer made knitting machines. Knitting machines are something that, as far as I know, they are not, besides industrial ones, knitting machines for the homemaker are not really in production anymore. They're kind of hard to come by, which is really unfortunate. I know that people who have knitting machines tend to have a hard time finding replacement parts for them. They have to scour eBay and look for like dead stock or things from estate sales. It's just kind of a hard, scarce marketplace. I have a confession. This is the second time I've done this in my life where I've had to give away something that's an incredible piece of crafting hardware, and it's because I'm moving and I just have to like get rid of things, and I don't have time to figure out how to sell it or get it to the right person, and I have to give it to Goodwill. The first time was a Singer sewing machine that it was a cast iron kind of Victorian one that would fold it down into a table and then you could flip it up. Oh, it was so cool. It was like a foot treadle, really heavy, and just I couldn't move it. I had like a tiny little car, and yeah, that I hope it went to a good home. So yeah, the knitting machine was very old and needed a lot of refurbishment, and I never got around to it, and I didn't think I was going to in the near future, so I thought I need to set this free, I need to put it back in the world, and I dropped it off at Goodwill, and I let the person know, the person who was collecting the item. I'm sure they thought I was a little nuts. I was like, this is really valuable. I know it doesn't look like much, it's like dusty and then this duct tape boxed, but like please, this is good. Like I didn't know how to convey to him that this was like a special treasure. So I hope it went to someone in the area that's gonna use it and be happy. I think machine knitting is pretty cool. I did learn how, I want to say like 5 or 6 years ago. I took a class locally. I was very lucky to have someone really close to where I live who could teach me. Her name is Helen Sharp, and she may still be teaching. At the time, she was working on a textbook, which again, that's like another thing that's kind of hard to come by, is resources for learning how to troubleshoot. A lot of machine knitting is troubleshooting, which maybe that's part of what didn't appeal to me totally about it, is that you spend a lot of time figuring out mistakes, correcting them, making adjustments, and trying to figure out like how to make it do what you want it to do. The upside is that you can create miles of fabric very quickly, and especially monotonous stuff like stockinette. So that's really cool. There's also lots of effects you can do where you don't have to learn necessarily how to do like stranded knitting for one. This is a sample that I have that I made that is a houndstooth pattern, and to do this all I had to do was load a cartridge in. It was like a punch card kind of thing, and that just made the pattern. So like no tensioning, no juggling floats or 2 strands of yarn at one time, no bobbins or anything like that. Like yeah, it's pretty cool. So there's definitely like huge upsides to machine knitting, but it just wasn't for me, like not at this time in my life. Maybe one day, maybe someone will start making them again. Maybe someone does make them. I don't know. I need to look into it. As predicted, this is taking ages to edit, just because I'm new at learning how to incorporate clips and, you know, multimedia stuff. But in the time that I have been editing this, Rachel Maxey, who is one of my favorite YouTubers and actually one of the inspirations for even starting this channel, she uploaded a video. She found a knitting machine in her old home's basement. It was her grandmother's, and she basically filmed herself learning how to use it and making her first project, which is a little crop top, a hobbity vest, as she is wont to do. I am amazed and impressed that she got it up and running. She kind of pushed through all of the like roadblocks. I was sitting there watching it like with bated breath, thinking of all the parts that might need to be replaced, and just like honestly the fact that she was able to learn from a book, I'm super impressed. She has a reputation for being sort of like slapdash. I think she leans into that, but she's also a perfectionist, so I really, yeah, I'm very pleased to include her in the ranks of knitters now. And also I was inspired to kind of look up and see. I said that Helen Sharp is the person who taught me. Locally, I took classes at her knitting school in Seattle, but she is no longer teaching in person, but even better, she's managed to get a lot of video courses filmed and up. So you can subscribe. I think you can take one-off classes, or you can subscribe and watch unlimited content. So I sent that to Rachel. I hope she gets in touch and takes some classes from Helen. Yeah, I just wish you all the best, Rachel, if you're gonna watch this. Yeah, thanks for all the like crafting inspiration over the years, and also just good luck on your knitting journey. Also, I went back, turns out it had been like 10 years since I learned how to do that. I think I took the classes in 2014. So I scrolled all the way back in my Instagram and found some snapshots. Enjoy all these little snapshots from I think I took multiple classes. So I was seeing Helen pretty much all summer in 2014, learning how to machine it. And I am super regretting taking that machine to Goodwill. I almost want to go maybe online. I know I follow someone online who always scores amazing stuff on Goodwill's website. Maybe I can look and see if it's up there, or maybe, yeah, see what's out there. I have the urge majorly after seeing Rachel get up and running with her machine. That's it. Back to the video. So the next movie I want to talk about is Everything Everywhere All at Once. It swept the Oscars basically with nominations in nearly every category and then wins. It absolutely deserves them, I believe, because it was one of the most unique films I've ever seen. If you haven't seen it yet and you have the chance to see it in theaters, I think it's come back to theaters because of its wins. I would absolutely recommend doing that because it is so visually overwhelming. I just don't know if even the biggest home television set is going to do that justice. So I think it deserves a trip to the movies, and yeah, it was incredible. And there's so much happening that honestly, I'm sure there's knitwear that I missed. There were two scenes that kind of stood out to me as having some knitwear of note. One of them was, again, mild spoilers, but the images are everywhere. So the hot dog multiverse slice, where Michelle Yeoh's character and Jamie Lee Curtis's character are sort of partnered. They are wearing what looks to me like cocoa knits, very Eileen Fisher kind of neutrals, layering, sort of sumptuous textures, and maybe cashmere, twin sets, things like that. So that was the first kind of moment of knitwear that I noticed. And I think they're even knitting in one scene with their feet, which is really funny because they have hot dogs for fingers. Just one small part of the comedy and visual gag fest that this movie is. The movie's also really moving, like as silly and over the top as it is, it's incredibly moving. The Daniels do that so well, balancing humor and absurd visuals with truly moving moments and commentary on just life and the beauty and the mundane. I really liked their first film. I think it was their first, Swiss Army Man, with Daniel Radcliffe and Paul Dano. I love that Daniel Radcliffe is like leaning into these sort of roles that are just so off kilter and far away from the Harry Potter universe. Like, loved him in that, but love him even more in his later career. At the end of the film, Michelle Yeoh wears a cardigan that is red and it has sort of these beautiful leafy fronds on the sides, and it has the word punk on the back in Intarsia. And it's really funny. A lot of people took note of it and have like clamored to buy a replica. The costume designer, her name is Shirley Kurata. She has also worked on one of my favorite rom-coms. I'm not even a rom-com fan really, but Win a Date with Tad Hamilton. Super good, really underrated, stars Topher Grace. and Kate Bosworth and Josh Duhamel. I don't think I'm saying that right. My memory card was full, I had to deal with that. So, yeah, the punk cardigan. So it was recently auctioned off by A24, and people, like I said, were scouring Chinatown. Basically, the designer, the costumer, said that she found it in Chinatown, she bought it off the rack, and she felt like that's just something that Evelyn, this character, would have done. Here's a quote from Kurata about sourcing that sweater. "It's funny because a lot of products from Asia, sometimes there's a word on it and like, why is it there? The homely sweater's unintentionally subversive message also augmented what Kurata wanted to convey about Evelyn and her mostly unacknowledged struggle and accomplishments. Her character is punk rock," she says. "At first, you don't think that, but immigrant parents that have come to this country, and English is not their native language, and started this business, that's punk rock. If someone asked me to go to a country where I don't speak the language and start a business, that's scary." Gold Star just joined us. So you met Johnny Utah in the last video. He's actually my, not stepson, but he was my husband's cat when we met. We've been together 10 years. But yeah, this is Gold Star. She was mine, is mine still. Now we have a blended household. It's like a Brady Bunch. So Intarsia, it's funny. A lot of people think that it's like the scariest thing you can do in knitting. And to a certain extent, it is up there in the advanced techniques. It requires working with two colors or, many colors. Intarsia, which was used to place that floating big word on the back of this cardigan, it's considered to be one of the more advanced and more intimidating techniques in knitting. I've actually taught classes on it before. I totally understand why. I think it's because it requires patience and finesse, and those are things that I think when you're nervous and you're just starting out, you tend to either rush through things that are difficult or just get it over with, or almost like white knuckle your knitting and sort of grip things really tightly. Those are sort of the two things that happen, I think, that are really, really bad for Intarsia. I apologize if the lighting and framing is like wonky in this video. I've been jumping up and down, dealing with cats. It's like very, just trying to get through this. It's, like I said, it's probably gonna be a long one. So what I was talking about was Intarsia and how one of the things you can do to sort of help yourself and help it be less difficult is understand that patience is your friend. So last time we spoke, I was finishing up a project. It's almost done. This is a little baby romper that I was knitting. I did a contrast. I believe this is the back with short rows for the butt. I did finally figure out the leg openings were definitely, I misread the directions and I didn't do enough decreases. So once I did that, I like fixed the issue and they are much more drawn in. They're still a little large, but I think room to grow is never a bad thing. But yeah, I want to embroider something here just to kind of dress it up. It's definitely like, I went with a drab, sort of vintage inspired color palette, like a gray lilac. But yeah, I really like how it turned out. But I was talking about how Kitchener is not my favorite and how I had to do that for the crotch gusset. Kitchener is one that when you're grafting stitches together and you're working with kind of open loops or multiple, rows of loops at the same time, it can be tempting to sort of do that sewing step and then tighten it up and get your tension perfect as you go, but it's actually way easier to just worry about the order and how you're doing the grafting, get that down, and then go back later and tighten things up and adjust the tensioning. So once I kind of figured out that that was possible and actually preferable, the whole worry about like juggling all of that at once was lifted and I was able to work a lot easier. The same is true for Intarsia. So I am a huge fan of Kaif Fassett. He is commonly associated with Rowan. He does a lot of custom colorways for them. He's always worked with their yarns. He does beautiful, beautiful color work. Often it's Intarsia, has been working for years, has an incredible cat. There's a beautiful cat across the street. It's a big puffy Himalayan. So cute. Speaking of beautiful colorways. Anyhow, so Kaif's advice, and yes, we're on a first name basis. No, not really. He advised, instead of using bobbins, just let the yarn dangle. I believe this was his tip. It's been years since I've read his books, but I always used to check them out from the library and like hoard them for weeks. So he would say just measure out like a yard's worth, an arm's length of yarn that you needed for that section, and know that you might run out quickly, more quickly than you would if you had a bobbin loaded up with yarn, but just let that yarn sort of dangle behind the work as you're working. What you find is that if you have it wound onto bobbins, they tend to get tangled. They're just like, they really kind of mess with each other, and they get all tangled up, and you have to untangle them. With the strands of yarn, they just sort of lay there, they're weightless, and especially if you're working with something like wool where it's like kind of Velcro-y, it's not gonna really get tangled. It just doesn't happen as long as you're working with patience. That's the thing, is like you have to stay calm, you have to be in a quiet, restful area, you know, don't do this on the bus, and then just like gently pull free the strands that you need for that section. If it does get a little tangled, like rake your fingers through it to kind of loosen it, but it does work a lot better in my opinion than bobbins. So little Intarsia tip. I think the other thing to remember about Intarsia is that you have to make sure you're using the right kind of graph paper. This is Knitter's graph paper, and you can see that it is wider than it is tall. This is to mimic the actual dimensions of a knitted stitch. If you don't use paper or adjust your pattern for that consideration, and that's a stockinette stitch, so the V stitch, your pattern will come out looking a little distorted. So I had this experience firsthand when I knit one of my biggest Intarsia projects I can remember. It was a sweater with a squirrel on the front, and it had like an acorn. And I think that the gauge I was working at, it was a bulky, like a heavy worsted, and I think I was at 4 stitches to the inch or something, and the detail just wasn't there. I couldn't do like smooth curves. I mean, I kind of could, but I mean, it's always going to look somewhat pixelated. You can kind of smooth out the edges with embroidery. I did that. I outlined some areas to sort of define it. But yeah, I thought it was cute. It was supposed to be like an 80s nature sweater, what I sometimes call like homeschool kid clothing, like nature, yeah, like wolves, things like that, like emblazoned on a shirt. So yeah, I did that. I love squirrels. I've always loved them. And one of the best comments that will never leave my mind is it was on Ravelry, and somebody said, "That looks like a squirrel fetus." And I was like, thanks a lot. I spent a lot of time working out that chart, and then I do believe I knit that one myself. Maybe a sample knitter helped. Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot. Oh, the internet is fun. The other tip I would give is just don't be afraid to play with texture for contrast. I mean, if you want to mix, you know, mohairs or fuzzy novelties or glittery things and, you know, contrast them against matte things, I think that's always fun in an Intarsia sweater, and I think that's definitely going on in the one here. Yeah, this one is like pretty unique, and I think that if you want to find something just like it, I think there are people making kind of replicas. It's probably only a matter of time before somebody makes charts for this, and if it hasn't already happened, if it has, I'll put them in the description box. But I have seen replicas that you can purchase online, but also I encourage you to knit your own and pick your own kind of somewhat random word for the back and let it empower you. And just remember, get the right graph paper. You can also print sheets of this off the internet. This is a notebook especially made for the purpose, but yeah, I used to also go online and like download PDFs. We are almost at the main course of this video, and it's a good thing because I'm losing daylight. Yeah, again, I apologize for fluctuations. I think it's more about the content here. I'm hoping to have like clips and images. I'm sure this is gonna be a beast to edit. But yeah, I apologize. I'm basically Canadian. Before we get to the meat and potatoes of this video, the main event, that's another clue by the way, I want to give a special mention to Top Gun Maverick. This was a movie that last year, it was definitely something I was excited for, but not because I was personally invested in the Top Gun franchise. I'm not the biggest fan of Tom Cruise. I'm just not an action movie person in general. My husband definitely grew up watching Top Gun. I had watched it maybe once or twice and, you know, didn't think much of it. It was fine. It was funny, you know. I had low expectations going into this movie, and now looking back, like, it's being called the movie that saved movies, or just saved the experience of going to theaters. I know that it was held for 2+ years through the pandemic so that it could have a theatrical release. I think it was also the first movie that my husband and I went to go see in Dolby, and we had never seen something in Dolby. We don't always go for IMAX, but if a movie is really important to us, we'll go for, you know, kind of the better technology that if we can get it. Dolby kind of blew our minds as far as the sound and the sound quality, the picture quality. The seats were like leather reclining seats, and it was just a really pleasant movie-going experience. And then like the crowd was electric here. Like I think I heard grown men crying. It was really, that's always fun. But yeah, so the soundtrack, the nostalgia, you know, a lot of it was just working. My favorite part of the movie was the fact that the snowy parts towards the end of the film, they were filmed over the Cascade Mountains. So those are pretty close to us. There's a place I go every summer that you can drive right through the same area that they were flying over. So I think it was just really special. They're so beautiful, these mountains, and the fact that they were the piece de resistance in this movie just like warmed my heart as an honorary Seattleite now. So I'm getting to the point. The sweater that I want to mention was on Jennifer Connelly. It's in a boating scene. So she's actually taking him out for a sail. And this is, you know, he's like the hotshot on the motorcycles and on all these jets, and she is the expert here. And so I loved that part, that she was sort of literally taking this giant wheel, and she was doing it while wearing a navy blue nautical sweater. It looked like it had some texturing sort of cables and then maybe some garter or seed texture. Pretty simple, like not super huge and baggy, sort of a relaxed silhouette. I would say that it reminded me of Penny Straker, Debbie Bliss from the 90s, and then Kim Hargreaves a little bit. Kim Hargreaves is pretty classic as well. So just like really restrained, classic proportions and really restrained use of texture, but it looked incredible on her. Like she's got the white jeans, the sunglasses, and like her hair is always so dark, but for this movie they actually got her to go like kind of a lighter, sun-kissed, like auburny brunette. Oh, it was incredible. So special shout out to that cotton sweater. I do have to mention that I can't look at the sweater like this and not think of Clara Parks, who like continually roasts Land's End and LL Bean for putting out sweaters like this that are pure cotton, because that is the last thing you want to be wearing to stay warm on the high seas. Like as soon as it gets wet, it's going to be so heavy and so clammy and so bad for retaining body heat. Like I hope this is a merino sweater for Jennifer Connelly's sake. Oh, I forgot to mention the costumer for Top Gun was Marlene Stewart. She works on a lot of action and adventure movies, and I don't think she had anything to do with it, but Jennifer Connelly's red carpet look here at the premiere, I am a huge fan. I love this. I want to borrow it. I want to replicate it. It's just A+. You can probably guess what the last movie on my list is. It is set in Ireland. It is the Banshees of Inisherin. Now, I am about 30% Irish. I did 23andMe a few years ago. My grandfather on my dad's side was Irish, and I've always had an affinity for Celtic culture. I'm an Anglophile in general. Like, if it's grassy and there are sheep, like, I'm into it. So this movie drew me in for that. It didn't disappoint. Like, I know a lot of folks have been puzzled by it. It is definitely on the grim, dark humor side. It's directed by Martin McDonagh, and the costumer I'm going to try. Emer ní Maldownig? Emer ní Maldowni. I've heard it pronounced a few ways. I don't think I did it right. I'm sorry. But Emer was the costumer, and she worked with a knitter, a local Irish knitter named Delia Barry. She knit the samples for the film based on photos of fishermen's sweaters from the 1920s. So the costuming is a huge part of why I enjoyed this film. It's set in the 20s, late 20s, early 30s, I believe. And I love period films in general, especially that era, and especially kind of rural workwear focused things. That is just like my sweet spot. So the costumer, she's also worked on Becoming Jane, with James McAvoy and Anne Hathaway. Foundation, which is a series that I've been meaning to get back to. It's based on Isaac Asimov, really like very complex sci-fi. I've only seen one episode, but I do remember being blown away by the costumes. And the Little Women miniseries that came out, I believe it was a BBC PBS kind of co-production, perhaps. It stars Maya Hawke as Jo, and it's actually, I think, so much better than the Gerwig adaptation. It's my particular fave of the modern Little Women's. I think the 94 version will always have my heart, but yeah, this one is great. I go back to it a lot. So I believe Delia also served as a knitting coach on set for Little Women when one of the characters needed to learn how to knit. So that's pretty cool. I think Emer has worked with her a few times and hopefully will continue to work with her. So she took up knitting, I think, when her husband passed away in 2010, and now she was basically nominated for an Oscar because that film was up for costuming. It did lose out to Ruth Carter for Black Panther Wakanda Forever. It was a tough category this year. So to get these sweaters done, she had a goal of knitting 100 grams of DK weight yarn every single day, and she had about a week to knit each sweater. They had to be knit in multiples, different versions, different colors, multiples just to cover, you know, stunt workers or stand-ins, things like that. This is about 150 grams. Actually, it's probably just about 100. So this is how much she was knitting, and this is DK, like a lighter DK, and I've been working on the sock that I'm making out of this for a week now. I'm not a fast knitter, and I knit a few rounds here and there, but that's quite a bit. I mean, that is knitting at a rapid clip, so good on her. The thing that I loved about the costuming in this film was that it really broadcast the mental state and sort of the interior life of these characters. So Siobhan, the sister of Colin Farrell's character Podrick, I apologize for my lack of Gaelic, she was wearing kind of fashions that were a little fashion forward, and it kind of indicated that she was aware of the world beyond their small island, and she kind of maybe had aspirations beyond living there. And then with the character of Dominic, he had this sort of really heart-wrenching home life, and his sweaters reflected that with sort of wear and tear. You could see holes that needed to be mended, singed cuffs, things like that were just, you know, showed that he had these sweaters for a long time and that there was maybe no one at home to mend the sweaters for him. Speaking of mending, I mean, it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility that these men would have mended their own sweaters. I think it was just like a lack of care situation. One of my favorite YouTubers, the Welsh Viking, just did a video on mending and how common it was for soldiers and sailors and, you know, those folks to be mending their own garments out on the field, you know, when they were away from the women folk. So definitely something that he could have done himself, but maybe just didn't, you know, it wasn't something that occurred to him, or there were larger concerns to deal with. Brendan Gleeson apparently loved the sweaters so much that he commissioned 2 more from Delia. I have a couple yarn sources that I'll link down below. It was, you know, she warned knitters that the yarn that she used for these sweaters was authentic, but a little bit rustic and kind of scratchy. So I think that's probably the best, you know, when you're dealing with that damp, misty climate, having that layer of coarse wool is actually the best thing. It keeps you dry and warm, and as long as you have like a layer between your skin and the sweater, it's the best. So if you can handle it, go for it. The most distinctive thing to me about these sweaters, because you know, you see fisherman sweaters in a lot of period films, and you know, they're always fun to look at, but these sweaters had collars, and they were very long pointed collars, and I can't honestly remember seeing a lot of collars on sweaters like this. They generally have like a ribbed collar band, or I've seen one in a Gansey book, a Dutch Gansey book, that it sort of stands up and then there's eyelets, an I-cord threaded throughout and forming like a drawstring to kind of pull it closed. I thought that was really cool looking. Sort of a precursor to today's hoodies. So Delia said that, and I hope I'm saying her name right, said that she had not knit collars like this before that were so long and pointed, and I'm not clear on who gave that direction, if it came from reference photos or something else, but she had to experiment quite a bit, and that's really what you have to do with knitting, is you have to see like what proportion of increases or decreases are you going to have to do to get the right pitch, the right angle, the right thickness at the right point, and the right curve. Like with the collar, you're dealing with a dimension that's sort of, you're curving around and you're folding back sometimes, and you need to have like, you need to start with a smaller needle maybe for the collar stand, and then go up in needle size as you go over that fold to make it lay better. So there's all these considerations. Your bind off is going to affect like how it lays, and a lot of trial and error, I'm sure. I really enjoyed seeing a photo of the collar that was safety pinned on. So it looks like instead of picking up stitches and knitting from the collar band or the neck band, she was actually knitting them separately and pinning them on and sort of trialing it out. I did see one case where the sweater and the collar were slightly different shades, and I thought that was really cool. Again, in Jimmy's video about mending, he called out the fact that you often get these like patchwork hodgepodge, this is with woven textiles, you get this collage appearance, and it's, I think, very cool and appealing. They just were making do with what they had and maximizing kind of resources. With knitting, like, I think that's really cool to just, maybe that was what they had. Maybe it was a dye lot difference. Like maybe that the dye bath like was weak by that point and it didn't fully saturate with color. Like it just kind of opens the imagination to all these possibilities, and I really enjoyed that. We're getting close to the end, I promise. So I do want to talk about my experience knitting collars, and it's funny, nothing came to mind right away, but then when I started to look at my backlog of patterns, I've knit like literally, this is a standalone collar. So this is actually something I'm really proud of because I think it's kind of inventive, and it's called the Marion collar, and it was designed to go as a pair with this cardigan on the cover of my book. So the idea is that you can wear the cardigan by itself, maybe during the day, and then at night when you're about to go out, or if it's cold outside, the weather's taking a turn for the worse, you can put on this little accessory collar, and it provides just a little extra color, a little extra warmth. There's a hook and eye closure. You can kind of hook it closed. I think this is one of my all-time favorite colors, chartreuse. So this was very inspired by this collar here, which is from Iceland. It's from a company called Felder Verkstæði. Again, pardon my Icelandic pronunciation. But basically this is a satin-backed accessory piece. It has a hook and eye here and these long ties, and I wanted to make a fur-free alternative here. This is curly locks that have come off of a sheep and have not been carded or spun into wool. It's just kind of a free lock. And there aren't that actually many of them. This is kind of matted, it's been in storage for a long time, but I knit a base of Angora, and then I used a thrumming method or a kind of a rug hooking method to just thread these through and just hook these locks every so often to create the illusion of a shearling. So while it is wool, it's definitely not a vegan accessory. It's not fur, so it's a nice alternative. And I found someone on Etsy selling these dyed in all of these amazing colors. I have a rainbow bag as well. I think I worked that into another design in the book called Studio, the Studio pullover. Yeah, you can see it on the back here. So had a lot of, the thing I wanted to mention as well is if you're worried about itchy yarn next to a collar, something that I've always done is if you're knitting the body of the sweater in a coarse wool, you can do the facing of the collar in a softer yarn. So for this one I used I believe it's a cashmere tweed, just to do sort of the lining, the thing that would be sitting next to your skin. I've done cotton blends before. Yeah, anything that's going to be slightly softer. Usually you want to go down a little bit with the weight and the needle size so it doesn't bulk it up too much. But yeah, that's a good option, and I also like that it gives it a little bit more body so it kind of stands up. There's a little more drama, a little more structure. It's not going to flop everywhere. But in some cases you do want it to flop, and yeah, that's a possibility too. So how do you design the collar that you want? In some cases you are going to want that drape. So how do you go about designing and planning a collar that's going to make you happy? For me, the resources that I've always leaned on are Maggie Righetti's Sweater Design in Plain English, the Vogue Knitting Encyclopedia. I believe it's called like the Complete Knitting book. It's massive. There's also a smaller quick reference guide that I really love. That has sort of like a table in the back where you can sort of build your own, like you combine elements, sleeve elements and waist shaping elements, and then collar, cuff, everything. You can kind of look at those directions sort of a la carte and combine them as you will. Probably the best resource and like fantastic thing to have on hand, 2 books by Deborah Newton. So one of them is Designing Knitwear. The other one is Finishing School. I think it's called A Masterclass for Knitters. That one is more recent. Designing Knitwear has been out for a long time. If you can find an original copy, I would recommend it just for the very like 80s, 90s sketches. something that I did a lot of when I was in college and I couldn't really afford to buy many books is I would go to the library and just, like I said, case facet, whatever was on the shelf, like I inhaled it and absorbed everything that was in those books, and grew to really love like that look. It was just I was really fond of the 90s and 80s aesthetic of knitting. I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for like 80s and 90s knitwear. I wasn't really a knitter then, but it informed a lot of my early education, self-education. So what Deborah recommends, and she gets into all the math of it as well. I think you need, again, back to graph paper, you do sometimes need to do some math to figure out where you might increase or what size this needs to be. And there's so many different collar varieties. It is like a trial and error sort of thing. Just like button bands, I mean, any finishing detail, you're probably gonna just count on the fact that you're gonna be ripping and redoing probably a couple of times if you don't have a pattern you're working from, even if you do have a pattern, honestly. She recommends doing a swatch, a very large swatch, and not only does that give you more information about your stitch pattern and your yarn, but it gives you a chance to do some finishing work. So she says you can do like a button band, try out your buttonholes, do your collar, you know, swatching there, and then you end up with this like cute artifact that is like a little mini half sweater kind of thing. I think that's brilliant. So lastly, I went back through my catalog and looked through sweaters that had collars, and I was sort of shocked at just how many of them did have collars. I guess I was a collar fan. I think it's always been like a very dramatic thing. It's face framing, it adds warmth, it's just practical. Another collar moment that sort of sticks out to me was the 8A cardigan. So that's the cabled, oversized, chunky knit that probably is my most viral and well-known pattern. This is talking like 10 years ago, so the numbers are, you know, relative. But I remember like this story I've told over and over again, but that was a sample that I was knitting, and my hands, I was knitting it on a deadline. My hands actually started to go numb because I was knitting at a dense gauge and really around the clock. And it had button band, or I intended to put button bands on. Ooh, okay, a little bit of a creepy connection. The 8A cardigan was actually inspired by something that I saw Greta Gerwig wearing in the movie Greenberg? I can't remember. It's been years. Yeah, so the sweater was like a oversized Aran, and it was meant to have button bands, but like I said, my hands were going numb. I was desperate to get this finished. We had a photo shoot coming up, and Nora at the time, my boss, took the sweater from me and said, "Don't worry about it. I will finish this. Like, go home and get some rest." So we show up to the next day, the photo shoot, and I'm like totally distraught because my sweater doesn't have the button bands I intended it to have. But what she did was she had the brilliant idea to just extend the lapels, not the lapels, the front sections of the sweater. She extended them and then 3-needle bound off in the back to form this really cool shawl collar that wraps around. So, and the cables, the way they worked, they kind of like matched up really nicely. It looked incredible. It was brilliant, like typical Nora. It saved the day and looked even better than I intended. Like, I don't think I could have done that on my own. So yeah, I'm grateful to this day for the save. Okay, just going back through some names. Jordan cape from my book has a neon lining. I thought that was pretty cool. The Laura vest uses the same trick as the 8A cardigan with the neck that joins from the front pieces. Andre was a moto jacket that had some fold over lapels. Definitely playing with moto shapes a lot. I think Nora definitely had to help me with that, with the mathing of that. Alska, another fold over collar, I believe. Hibiki, that was kind of a sailor, almost like a lapel with contrast yarn. Double-decker cardigan, here's another lapel. Ravenna, I believe this is a chunky jacket that had stitching to kind of highlight the collar placement. Contrast, I love a contrast element, either if it's a bind off or a stitching. Baudelaire, okay, Baudelaire, I can see things that I would change about it, but this one was a big hit at the time. It had a collar that was, I believe, sideways garter knit in a chunky yarn, and then using the worsted weight version of that same fiber blend, there was a ruffle that we sewed into the inside that was just like a pretty face framing. It was a pretty face framing little accent, kind of like a fichu or something like that. So super cute. Silverman, another lapel. Astrolorp, I don't remember this one. Nankin. I think these all look very similar. I believe this is like the double-breasted lapel kind of thing. I think I figured out how to do it and then just wouldn't stop for a while. What do they say? Borrow from your own repertoire? I did that. Faverol. It goes on and on. Trinket Tank. Trinket Tank was my very first design ever, if you're not counting the Kurt Cobain sweater that I never finished as a teen. Trinket Tank was a collared turtleneck tank top, a halter top. And yeah, it had a little like ribbed fold over collar. And weirdly enough, these are kind of trending again. So I have seen these like patterns and in stores and kind of on models. Maybe it's the 90s resurgence that like refuses to die. I'm totally fine with that. I don't think it was the 90s when I designed that. It was probably early 2000s. But yeah, I remember looking back at that and being like, what weather would it need to be to wear a shoulder-bearing turtleneck knitted top? I don't understand. It does not compute. Like, what was I thinking? Live and learn, or knit and learn. I need an outro, a catchphrase. Knit and learn might be a contender. What do you think? Thoughts below. Knit and learn. Lastly, I'll just share what I'm knitting. I'm making a very basic sock. This is a heavier sock yarn, so it's going really quickly, which I enjoy. This is Austerman Step 6. I believe 6 refers to the plies, and it's like a DK sportish. I would say more on the sport side, but this is the yarn that has aloe vera kind of impregnated into the fibers. I did like a seated rib on the cuff and just a basic slip stitch heel. I'm the most vanilla sock knitter in the world. I don't do anything fancy or clever. I've tried it all, but for me, the most satisfying thing is just double pointed needles. Oh, we're coming full circle again. Chris Pine needed some DPNs. And yeah, just the basic, you know, one after the other. The trick with this is like, will I cast on for the other sock immediately so that it has a vague chance of being the same size and gauge and everything? Fingers crossed. I'll let you know in the next video. The next video will be, as I teased in the first one, Taylor Swift related and kind of a summer project. It'll also be more design focused, meaning that I'll actually be doing some of the things that I've talked about. Let me know what you thought about this video. This was very gabby. I know that, like I said, it's going to be a beast to edit. Hopefully I can make it coherent. If you have any feedback, feel free to drop it in the comments. You can follow me on Instagram at Bricolore Knits, and Cerelia, just my first name. All right, I think that's it for me today. The sun is going down and I need to think about what I'm gonna watch tonight. I'll see you next time. Bye. Ooh, can I do this classic YouTuber? Is that cringe? You can tell me if it is. Yikes. This tripod is a nightmare. I need some WD-40. What the fuck? Is that somewhat straight?